Here's the thing nobody tells you about the most dangerous person in a room. They're never the loudest one. They're not the one with the biggest shoulders or the deepest voice or the most medals pinned to their chest. They're not standing at the front with their arms crossed, trying to look like something worth fearing. They're not performing. They're not posturing. They're not doing any of the things that people who want to seem dangerous do. The most dangerous person in any room in any galaxy, as it turned out, is the one sitting quietly in the back. The one you forget is even there. The one whose name you never bother to learn. I know this because I was in that room. I was one of the people who forgot she was there. And I have spent the last 14 months trying to figure out how to live with what happened next, what she did, what it cost her, what it cost all of us who sat there and assumed she was nobody. Her name was Mara Voss. And I need you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this. I need you to understand that we ignored her, completely, deliberately, not out of cruelty. I want to believe that, but out of the particular kind of blindness that comes when you've already decided what a person is before they've opened their mouth. We looked at her, and we saw a quiet girl in a worn jacket sitting at the back of a room she didn't seem to belong in, and we made our decision, and we moved on. We were wrong in a way that I still don't have the right words for. This is me trying to find them anyway. Set up. The Alias station was not built to be beautiful. I want to get that out of the way early because people who haven't been there sometimes imagine it as something elegant. One of those gleaming orbital platforms from the recruitment vids, all curved glass and clean light and the slow wheel of distant stars. That's not what Alias was. Alias was built in a hurry during the third expansion, which meant it was built cheap, and it showed. The corridors were narrow and low-ceilinged, and the air recyclers were ancient enough that you could hear them working. This constant low mechanical hum that never went away, that you stopped consciously noticing after about 3 days, but that still showed up in your dreams. The lighting panels were the old amber spectrum kind that made everyone look slightly ill, and the floor plating had been walked on by enough boots over enough decades that the metal had gone smooth and faintly gray, like old bones. It smelled like recycled air and industrial solvent, and depending on which section you were in, whatever the mess hall was cooking that shift, which was usually something involving processed protein and a sauce that had no right to be the color it was. None of that mattered to any of us when we arrived. We weren't there for the ambience. We were there for the assessment. The Interstellar Defense Cooperative, the IDC, though half the people on station just called it the Combine, which the brass hated, ran an annual selection program for their vanguard units. Special operations, long-range, high-autonomy missions in contested space. The kind of work that didn't make it into recruitment vids because the people who did it either weren't allowed to talk about it or weren't around anymore to try. The selection process was brutal by design and famous throughout the colonies for breaking people who had spent years convincing themselves they were unbreakable. The washout rate in the first week alone was somewhere around 60%. I'd heard numbers as high as 75. What came out the other end, if anything came out the other end, was supposedly worth the cost. I say supposedly because at the point where this story begins, I hadn't seen it for myself yet. None of us had. We were all still in the pre-assessment phase, which is what they called the 3 days before the actual selection started, where they put you in a room and gave you forms to fill out and medical clearances to complete and lectures to sit through about conduct and protocol, and the 17 different ways you could disqualify yourself before you'd even begun. They also put you in that room with the other candidates, which is where it started, where all of it started. There were 41 of us that cycle. The briefing room was one of those tiered spaces, seats arranged in a shallow amphitheater shape around a central podium, which was currently empty, the facilitating officer not yet arrived. The overhead panels threw that amber light across everything. The air recyclers hummed. Through the small viewport on the far wall, you could see the edge of the Kessler Nebula doing what it always did, which was exist in a state of impossible slow-motion beauty that felt completely at odds with everything else about Deadliest Station. People were doing what people do when they're nervous and don't want to show it. The big ones were taking up space deliberately, spreading shoulders, setting their jaws, doing that thing where you make your physical presence as large as possible because you've confused volume with readiness. There were 5 or 6 of them in the front rows, all male, all built like they'd been designed in a facility, all radiating a kind of aggressive confidence that was probably mostly adrenaline. The decorated ones were doing the quiet version of the same thing, wearing their service history on their sleeves in the form of unit patches and insignia, letting others read the record without having to say a word. I recognized a 7th orbital patch, a rim fire emblem, something I was pretty sure was Blackwatch. Good units, hard units, people who'd earned the right to be in this room. I was doing my own version of nervous performance, which was sitting in the 3rd row and studying the data packet they'd handed us at the door with more focus than it strictly deserved, because looking busy was my preferred method of not having to make eye contact with anyone. And then there were the people who didn't fit either category. There was a wiry woman near the middle who sat so still she barely seemed to breathe. Turned out she was ex-recon, spent 4 years doing solo survey drops on precontact worlds, and stillness was apparently something you developed after enough time alone in places where moving wrong meant dying. Her name was Phyllis. She was one of the 7 of us who made it through. There was a heavyset man with a shaved head and reading glasses, actual physical reading glasses, which you almost never saw anymore, sitting near the side wall making handwritten notes in a small notebook. He had the quiet, methodical quality of someone doing a calculation. His name was Draven. He made it through too. And there was the girl in the back. I almost didn't notice her. That was the thing. I did one of those automatic room scans that you do when you walk into a space, that unconscious social inventory where you catalog who's present and assign them rough mental tags, and she registered and then immediately didn't. She was just there, present but somehow not demanding any portion of attention. She was sitting in the last row, far left seat, which was the least visible position in the room. Whether that was deliberate I couldn't have said at the time. She had dark hair that she'd pulled back simply, no styling, just out of the way. She was wearing a jacket that looked like it had been worn in actual conditions rather than bought at a uniform shop, faded in specific places, reinforced at the elbows, the kind of worn-in quality you only get from use. No insignia, no patches. Nothing that told you where she'd been. She was holding a cup of station coffee and looking at the viewport with the expression of someone watching something only they could see. She wasn't doing anything, she wasn't performing, she wasn't posturing. She wasn't making conversation with anyone around her, and there was a kind of invisible perimeter around her. Not hostile, not aggressive, just the natural consequence of someone not putting out any social invitation. I looked at her for maybe 2 seconds. I looked away. I went back to my data packet. That was the sum total of my consideration of Mara Voss for the first 18 hours of our time on Deadliest Station. I know. The orientation briefing was led by a senior facilitator named Oak, who was one of those people who could deliver an enormous amount of information with very few wasted words. He was IDC Special Operations, recently rotated back from something classified, which you could tell not from anything he said but from the specific quality of his tiredness. Not the tiredness of overwork, but the tiredness of things you couldn't unpack in polite company. He stood at the podium and he talked about what the next 3 weeks would require of us, and he didn't dress it up, and he didn't try to make it inspiring, and he didn't use the word journey even once, which I respected enormously. He told us the rules. He told us the washout criteria. He told us that the physical trials were the easiest part, which produced a low murmur from the front rows that he silenced with a look that cost him nothing. He told us about the team assessment phases. That Vanguard selection wasn't just about individual capability, that the units operated in small autonomous groups, and the assessment reflected that we would be evaluated on how we functioned with others as much as on raw performance metrics. Somewhere in the middle of all this, the man sitting next to me, one of the front row types who'd ended up displaced to the second row when the front filled up, broad-shouldered, patch-heavy, name I later learned was Cass Hollowell, leaned slightly in my direction and said quietly, without looking away from Oak, "Who's the girl in the back?" I glanced back. Mara Voss was still in her corner, still holding the coffee, now apparently listening to Oak with the same quality of unhurried attention she'd been giving the viewport before. "No idea," I said. "No unit patch," Hollowell said, not an accusation, more like a curiosity he was turning over. "Nothing, you see that?" "Yeah. Weird." "Maybe civilian contract," I said, because the IDC did occasionally pull in specialists through civilian channels for Vanguard technical specialists, people with unique knowledge profiles. It wasn't common, but it happened. Hollowell made a sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite dismissal. He went back to listening to Oak. I went back to listening to Oak. And Mara Voss sat in the back of the room and said nothing, and remained as absent from our consideration as the hum of the air recyclers. The pre-assessment days had a scheduled social component, a shared meal on the first evening, which was supposed to function as an icebreaker. Station mess, long tables with bench seating, the amber light making the protein sauce look even more questionable than it smelled. It did what those things usually do, which is sort people into the groups they were already gravitating toward. The patch-heavy veterans clustered together and talked about units and operations, and the particular shorthand of shared military experience. The younger candidates, fresher faces, less history in their carriage, occupied the middle ground and tried to look like they belonged. A few people ate alone by choice. Mara Voss ate alone. She had a tray and she'd taken a corner seat at the far end of the last table, and she was eating with the same economy of attention she brought to everything else. Not hunched, not uncomfortable, just separate, like she'd calculated the precise amount of social engagement required of her and had arrived at 0 and was comfortable with that arithmetic. I noticed her because Hollowell pointed it out. "She hasn't talked to anyone," he said. We were sitting across from each other, me and Hollowell and a woman named Tors who'd done 2 tours on the Outer Rim in atmospheric combat units, and a quiet older guy named Bautista who'd barely said 10 words but seemed to be absorbing everything. "Maybe she's just not social," Tors said. "This is a team assessment program," Hollowell said. "Being not social is a tactical problem." "She's not talking to people at a dinner," Tors said. "That's not the same as not being able to function in a unit." "Indicators," Hollowell said. "That's all I'm saying." I looked at Mara Voss across the mess hall. She had a small device on the table beside her tray, looked like a reader, but she wasn't looking at it. She was looking at nothing in particular, thinking something. "What's her background?" I asked, not to anyone specific, more to the general air of the table. Nobody knew, nobody had talked to her, nobody had thought to. Which tells you something about how we were operating at that point. 41 candidates in a high-stakes assessment, and not a single one of us had gone to the woman sitting alone in the corner and said, "Hi, what's your story?" We'd sorted her into the category of unimportant and closed the file. The cost of that assumption was going to come due very soon. The physical orientation on the second day was when I first got a sense, just a sense, still not the full picture, that I might have made an error. They ran us through the station's training circuits, which were built into the lower decks, obstacle courses, pressure chambers, zero-G orientation modules, combat reflex assessments. All of it timed, all of it monitored, all of it designed to give the facilitators baseline data and to give us a preliminary look at each other. The front row contingent performed exactly as you'd expect. Hollowell in particular was impressive in a way that felt almost excessive. He moved through the obstacle circuits like he'd designed them, smooth and powerful and completely controlled. He'd done Blackwatch selection before washing out due to a shoulder injury, he'd told us at dinner, and he'd spent the intervening 18 months rebuilding. You believed it watching him. Tors was faster than she looked and technically precise, in a way that suggested someone who'd survived by thinking 2 moves ahead, rather than relying on strength. Bautista, the older quiet man, was methodical to a degree that was almost meditative. Not fast, never fast, but accurate in a way that added up to something. And Mara Voss went through the circuits in a way that was hard to categorize in the moment. She wasn't flashy. She wasn't blazing through times that made people stop and stare. She moved through the obstacle components at a pace that you'd describe as efficient rather than explosive. Every movement the minimum necessary, nothing wasted, nothing performed. She didn't scramble or strain. She climbed where climbing was needed, and she ran where running was needed, and she navigated the pressure transitions with an ease that suggested she'd been in far more hostile pressure environments than a training circuit. What I noticed, and I almost didn't, because she was still managing to do that thing where she occupied space without demanding attention, was her positioning. Not just in the obstacles, but in the in-between moments, the transitional seconds where you're moving from one element to the next. She was always slightly off-center from where you'd expect, always at an angle that opened up a broader sightline, always with her back to something solid when she stopped. I thought military habit, muscle memory, everybody here had some version of it. I didn't think anything more specific than that. Not yet. The combat reflex assessment was where I started to reassess my reassessment. It was a standard reaction protocol, simulated threat engagements, reaction time measurement, target prioritization under pressure. They used training rigs with haptic feedback so you knew when you'd been tagged, and the simulation environment was variable so you couldn't memorize a pattern. Most of us performed in a decent to strong range. Hollowell was excellent. Tors was very good. I was solid, which was the most accurate self-assessment I could give. Mara Voss's numbers didn't come out until the facilitator read the preliminary scores back to the group, and even then there was a pause, just a fraction of a second, the kind that you'd miss if you weren't paying attention, before he called her identifier. The scores weren't flashy. I want to be clear about that. They weren't the kind of numbers that made the room go silent and turn around. They were just consistently, quietly, at a level that didn't fit with the absence of any unit record we could identify, at a level that suggested something very specific about where she developed her skills. Hollowell caught it. He leaned over after the scores were read and said to me in a low voice, "Those reflex numbers." "Yeah," I said. "What does that score profile look like to you?" I thought about it. "Sniper," I said, because it did. The specific combination of reaction accuracy over reaction speed, the target prioritization pattern, the way her scores held completely flat under increasing pressure conditions while most people showed at least some degradation, that was a particular skill set. The kind you develop spending long hours being still, and then moving with absolute precision in very small windows. "That's what I was thinking," Hollowell said. We looked at her. She was standing near the edge of the group, not paying attention to the score reading, looking at something on the far wall of the training bay. Her coffee was still in her hand. How she kept obtaining station coffee I never fully understood. She seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of it. "Civilian contract," I said, circling back to my earlier guess. "Technical specialist, long-range engagement specialist." "Maybe," Hollowell said. He sounded like he wasn't quite buying it. Neither was I, actually. But I also wasn't ready to revise my mental category yet, because revising mental categories requires acknowledging that the category was wrong to begin with, and we're all a little slow about that. We moved on. The evening of the second day, I couldn't sleep. This was not unusual for me in new environments. The ambient sounds were different. The air pressure was slightly off from what I was used to. The recycler hum had a particular frequency on alias that sat right at the edge of annoying. I lay in my bunk in the candidate quarters and stared at the low ceiling and did what you do when you can't sleep, which is think about things you'd probably be better off not thinking about. I thought about the assessment ahead. I thought about Hollowell and Torres and Bautista, trying to calibrate who I wanted to stay close to in the team phases. And I thought about Mara Voss, which surprised me a little, because I'd spent 2 days barely thinking about her, and now here she was, taking up space in my late-night brain. I was trying to figure out what didn't fit. The no-patch thing was strange. The IDC wasn't strict about insignia in the pre-assessment phase. You wore what you had, or you didn't, but almost everyone from a military background showed something. Not because they were required to, because identity in service organizations is deeply tied to unit history, and people display it the way they display any identity marker. The absence of anything was unusual. But more than that, and this was what I couldn't quite articulate lying there in the dark, there was the quality of her movement, the way she occupied space. I'd been around a lot of trained military personnel in my career, and there was something specific about the way she moved that I couldn't quite place, that was sitting slightly outside the taxonomy I was trying to put her in. Later, when I understood more about where she'd come from, I would recognize what it was. The way she moved was the way you moved when you had spent a very long time in places where being seen meant being dead. On the morning of the third day, the last pre-assessment day before the actual selection began, the incident happened that changed the shape of everything. Or maybe incident is too small a word. I'll come back to this. The pre-assessment schedule included a group briefing with an updated operational context packet. Essentially, the IDC giving us a thumbnail version of the current threat environment in the contested zones we'd potentially be operating in. Strategic context, faction dynamics. The current state of contact with the Werk Combine, which is what the assembled military language of several dozen member civilizations had settled on calling the entity that had spent the last 11 years making the outer transit corridors extremely difficult to use, while remaining almost impossible to definitively engage. The Werk Combine. You have to understand what that name meant in 2387. If you've grown up after the Wheeler Accords, you might not have the same visceral relationship with it that my generation had. But when I was coming up, the Werk Combine was the thing, the defining threat, the reason the IDC had tripled its vanguard units in a decade, the reason Alias Station existed in this particular orbital position, the reason 41 people were sitting in a briefing room on their third morning of pre-assessment, trying to look like the words being said weren't making their skin tighten. The briefing officer, a different one from Oak, a tactical intelligence analyst named Paris, younger, sharper in the brittle way of someone who'd spent too long looking at bad data, was walking through the current disposition of Werk assets in the contested corridor when she put up an image on the display panel, and a change moved through the room like a temperature drop. The image was a schematic, a Werk battle formation type, the specific cluster assault pattern they used when they were moving against a fixed installation, highly recognizable if you'd seen it before. Deeply unsettling in a way that was almost architectural, because the Werk didn't fight the way humans fought, and the formations reflected that. They had a quality of alien logic, geometrically precise in a way that felt wrong to human spatial intuition. Paris was describing the formation, its components, the tactical doctrine behind it. And from the back of the room, quietly, Without raising her hand or doing any of the things that signal you're about to speak, Mara Voss said, "That's the Keth-Savar formation. Second generation. They revised it after the Delos engagement. You're looking at a pre-revision schematic." The room went very still. Paris stopped mid-sentence. She turned to look at the back of the room. We all turned to look at the back of the room. Mara Voss was sitting in the same seat she'd been in since the first day. She had her coffee. She was looking at the schematic on the display panel, not at Paris, not at the 40 people who were now staring at her. "The drive nodes and the second-tier flankers have been repositioned," she said. Same volume, same quality, like she was just finishing a thought she'd been having. Post-Delos revision moved them approximately 8 degrees starboard to compensate for the feedback exposure the original version had. The targeting window for the flankers is different in the revised formation. Narrower approach angle, better redundancy. Paris was quiet for a moment. "What's your source for that?" she said, not aggressive, genuinely asking. Mara Voss looked at her then, met her eyes. "Personal observation," she said. Another silence, longer. "You've seen the revised formation in the field," Paris said. "Yes." "Where?" Mara Voss didn't answer that. She just held Paris's gaze with an expression that wasn't rude or evasive, just bounded, like she'd answered what she was going to answer and had no interest in going further. Paris studied her for a moment. Then she turned to her display panel, pulled up a secondary schematic, compared something, and her expression did something that I still think about. It tightened, and then it smoothed out, and there was a quality in the smoothing that felt like a scientist encountering data that required a recalibration. "You're right about the node repositioning," Paris said. "I'll update the briefing packet." And that was it. Paris moved on. The briefing continued. But the room had changed. Or maybe the room was the same and we had changed, because we were all doing the thing you do when a category you'd assigned to someone stops fitting. That uncomfortable internal shuffling of assumption, that retroactive inventory of all the things you'd already decided. I turned around in my seat. Mara Voss was looking at the display panel again. Whatever had just happened, whatever that moment had cost her in terms of drawing attention, she'd already filed it and moved on. Hollowell was looking at me. His expression said, "See." I turned back around. I started paying attention. The lunch break after the briefing was the first time anyone actually tried to talk to her. It was Tors who did it, which I would have predicted if I'd thought about it, because Tors was the least performative person in the group and the most likely to approach something directly. She just walked to where Mara Voss was sitting, back corner again, same seat, and sat down across from her with her tray and said something. And I watched from 2 tables away while Mara Voss looked at her with that expression of unhurried assessment, and then, slowly, like something deciding whether the investment was worth it, began to talk. I couldn't hear what they were saying. I wasn't close enough. Tors came back to our table after about 10 minutes. She sat down. She picked up her fork. She didn't say anything for a moment. "Well," Hollowell said. Tors looked like she was still processing something. "She's been in the field," Tors said. "We gathered that," I said. "No," Tors set her fork down. "I mean she's been in the field, not support, not adjacent, not stationed somewhere that happens to see occasional contact. She has been doing active operations in contested Verk space for," she paused. She wouldn't give me a timeline, but the things she described knowing about the Verk, the way she described it. "Describe the way she described it," Bautista said. He'd been quiet as usual. Now he was paying close attention. "Like someone describing their own neighborhood," Tors said. "Like someone who has spent so much time in a place that the detail is just automatic, not reported, not briefed, lived." We were all quiet for a moment. "She has no unit markers," Hollowell said. "I know. No service record we can access." "I know." which means either she's civilian contracted with a classification level above what any of us are cleared for, or she's something else entirely, Hollowell said. He was working it out the same way he moved through obstacle courses methodically, covering ground. What's her name? Did she tell you? Myra Voss, Torres said. We all tried that name against our mental databases of IDC personnel and came up empty, which was itself information. I'm going to talk to Oak, Bautista said, just like that, decided. They won't tell you anything classified, Torres said. No, Bautista agreed, but I'll be able to tell what he doesn't say. He did talk to Oak later that afternoon. I don't know exactly what passed between them. Bautista was not the kind of person who reported out conversations in full detail, but he came back and found me alone in the corridor outside the candidate quarters, and he said, without preamble, "She's real." I gathered she was real, I said. I mean, her file is real. She exists in the system, but the access level on her classification is, he paused. He looked like he was measuring how much to say. I have a level 7 clearance. Oak has a level 9. He couldn't access her full record. I processed that. What level does that put her at? Minimum level 10, Bautista said, probably higher. Level 10 in the IDC clearance hierarchy was the operational classification tier, the level assigned to active deep cover assets, classified weapons programs, things that decision makers at the top needed to know about and everyone else didn't. It was not a tier that field soldiers typically inhabited. It was not a tier that people who'd done standard military service inhabited. What is she doing here? I said, in an open assessment program. Bautista looked at me steadily. What does it mean, he said, when someone with that classification level voluntarily enters a standard selection program? I thought about it, turned it over. It means they want to be assessed, I said. It means they want to be integrated into a unit, which means whatever they've been doing has been solo, Bautista finished. We looked at each other. That's a long time to be alone in contested space, I said. Yes, Bautista said, it is. He walked away down the corridor. I stood there for a while. The air recyclers hummed. Through the wall, somewhere, I could feel more than hear the faint vibration of the station superstructure, the deep structural sound of a very large thing existing very far from anywhere. I thought about a person spending an unknown amount of time, alone, in places that people with level 9 clearances couldn't fully access the records of. I thought about the way she moved, the way she watched the room without appearing to watch it, the way she'd corrected a tactical intelligence briefing from personal observation, and then immediately retreated back into her practiced absence. And I thought, we have been looking at this completely wrong. The quiet girl in the back wasn't absent. She was waiting. End of Part 1. Part 2, The Measure of Stillness. The first week. The actual selection began at 4:30 on day 4, when the lights in the candidate quarters came on at full intensity without warning, and a facilitator's voice through the comm said we had 6 minutes to be dressed and present in the lower training bay, and the 6 minutes was not a suggestion. 38 of us made it. 3 didn't, because 3 people had apparently decided in the night that they'd made a mistake and had processed their withdrawal before morning, which was always your right and never held against you. I'd seen it before in other programs, the quiet departure in the dark, the empty bunk in the morning, the slight adjustment in the room's social geometry as it absorbed the absence. 38 people standing in the lower training bay in the pre-dawn watch, in various states of wakefulness, in the specific kind of charged silence that comes from a group of people who all know that something real is beginning. Mara Voss was there, of course she was, same jacket, hair pulled back. Coffee? Impossibly. She was holding a cup of station coffee in the lower training bay at 4:30, which should have been physically impossible given that the mess hall didn't open for another 2 hours, and I genuinely do not know to this day how she obtained it. I asked her once later, and she just looked at me with that expression and didn't answer, which I chose to interpret as a classified operation. Oak addressed us briefly. He explained the first trial set. He did not use words like good luck. He dismissed us with a look and left. The first week of selection was what the IDC framework called the Physical Capability and Endurance Battery, which is exactly what it sounds like and worse than it sounds. Extended ruck marches through the station's external maintenance corridors with full load-bearing kit, hypoxic endurance trials in the pressure chambers, combat swim equivalents in the station's emergency water storage tanks, which were enormous and cold and had been repurposed for exactly this kind of training, sleep deprivation rotations, caloric restriction protocols, the kinds of things designed to find and exploit every weakness before the operational assessment phases, because a weakness you don't know about in training is a weakness that kills someone in the field. I performed adequately, more than adequately in some elements, less than I'd hoped in others. The hypoxic chamber work hit me harder than I expected, and I nearly flagged out at hour 16 of the second sleep deprivation cycle, which was the kind of thing that you didn't easily forgive yourself for even if you ultimately pushed through. Hollowell, as expected, was outstanding in almost everything physical. He had the kind of body that had been engineered through years of deliberate suffering into something that just didn't quit, and watching him work through the ruck marches and chamber trials was like watching very well-designed machinery. I respected it even when it made me feel inadequate in comparison. Tours adapted, that's the word I'd use. She wasn't the strongest or the fastest, but she had a quality of adjustment. When conditions changed, she changed with them, almost instantaneously, without the half-second of resistance that most people showed when they hit something harder than expected. Bautista was a mystery to me physically. He was older than most of us, and he moved with an economy that looked like it should add up to slowness and somehow didn't. He made every time standard, every benchmark, not by the kind of margin that drew attention, but consistently. Every single time. Rain, tired, carrying extra weight from a penalty rotation didn't matter. He was like a clock. In Maravas, I'm going to be honest about how this unfolded, which is to say, it unfolded slowly, and it unfolded wrong in my initial reading, and then it became something I'm still not sure I have the right frame for. She did not top the physical performance metrics in week 1. I want to be clear about that. In the ruck marches, she held solidly at midfield, not leading, not flagging, just present and consistent. In the strength-based elements, she performed in the lower middle range of the group, which was notable only because it wasn't what the reflex and reaction scores from the pre-assessment suggested you'd expect. What she did every time in every element. She finished. Not with anything left over, not coasting. She finished every trial at the threshold, right at the line, never over it but never below it either, in a way that, over several days, began to feel less like the performance of someone struggling, and more like someone operating at a very precise chosen output level. Like someone who knew exactly where the minimum requirement was, and had decided that expending anything above it was a waste of resources she preferred to keep in reserve. She's sandbagging, Hollowell said on the third night, when we were allowed a 4-hour sleep rotation, and were spending the first 40 minutes of it lying in our bunks talking instead of sleeping, the way you do when you're too tired to sleep. Is she? Torres said. Physical profile doesn't match the reflex scores. Something's off. Or she's got different training priorities, Torres said. Or she's conserving. Conserving for what? Hollowell said. This is the assessment. She's been in contested Verk space doing something classified, Bautista said from his bunk. His voice had the quality of someone who was already mostly asleep and was contributing from that territory. Whatever she was doing out there, Surviving it required a specific capability set. Maybe that capability set isn't the same as what week 1 of a standard selection program is measuring. Silence for a while. I keep thinking about what she said in the briefing, I said, about the Verk formation. I've been thinking about it too, Tor said. Personal observation, I said. That's what she said. She saw the revised Keth-Savar formation through personal observation, which means she was in a position to observe a Verk cluster assault formation from close enough to read the drive node positioning, Hollowell said. More silence. How close would you have to be, I said, to see that level of detail? Nobody wanted to say the number out loud, because the number was uncomfortably small. Very close. Closer than you want to be to a Verk cluster assault formation. Closer than most people who'd gotten that close had managed to stay alive. The moment that began to shift things, the first real, unambiguous shift, happened on day 9. We were running the navigation trial, which was a multi-phase traverse through the station's outer maintenance network. A series of corridors, access shafts, and external passage tubes that formed a maze of industrial infrastructure around the station's exterior. The network was mapped, but the maps were deliberate misleads. The facilitators had rerouted several paths and mislabeled several junctions, and the trial was as much about identifying the false information and navigating around it as it was about raw movement speed. We were running in ad hoc teams of 4, randomly assigned, rotated through, the team composition part of what was being assessed. My team that rotation was me, Hollowell, a woman named Cesar who'd been quiet in the group and turned out to be deeply competent in navigation-specific skills, and Mara Voss. First time I'd been directly paired with her. We hit the first deliberate mislabel about 12 minutes in, a junction marked as a through passage that turned out to be a dead end, which you could tell either by consulting the map and trusting it wrong, or by reading the physical environment and recognizing the markers of a passage that hadn't seen regular use. Cesar and I caught the mislabel within about 15 seconds, which felt good. Mara Voss had stopped before we got there. She'd stopped about 8 meters before the junction, just stopped still looking at something, not the map. Not the junction itself, something in the geometry of the corridor ahead. This branch is wrong, she said. I looked at her. We haven't checked it yet. The floor plating, she said. No wear pattern on the approach. Nobody uses this regularly, and the air flow from the junction is wrong direction for a through passage. I looked at the floor. She was right. The plating was the same smooth, walked gray that characterized the rest of the station, but the gradient was subtly off, less pronounced, less traffic history. And when I focused on it, I could feel what she'd said about the air, a pressure differential that didn't match a connecting passage. She's right, Cesar said, checking her own sensor tool. Dead end. Hollowell looked at Mara Voss with an expression that I was starting to recognize as his recalibrating face. How long did it take you to read that? He said. She didn't answer. She'd already turned to look at the alternative route. We took the alternative route. We hit the second mislabel and she caught it even faster before any of the rest of us had even flagged it as a question. And the third. Every wrong path, every false marker, every deliberate environmental misdirection, she caught them before they cost us time. By the fourth mislabel, none of us were checking the map anymore. We were just watching her. It was like having a compass that read something different from magnetic north, but that different reading was always right. When we debriefed back at the starting point, our time was the second fastest in the rotation. The fastest team had Bautista on it, who it turned out was ex-pathfinding units and had essentially done this for a living. But we were fast, faster than I expected, faster than I would have predicted with our team composition. The facilitator noted it, made a mark somewhere. How did you know? I asked Mara Voss, while we were walking back through the main corridor toward the rest area. She was quiet for a moment, long enough that I thought she wasn't going to answer. "You learn to read wrong places," she said, finally. "What a place looks like when something about it doesn't fit the pattern it should. The Werk, the way they set up approaches, the way they construct false routes. After enough time, you start seeing the same logic everywhere. In stations, in terrain, in how people set up spaces they're trying to redirect you through." She said it simply, like it was just fact. I let the words settle. "How long were you out there?" I asked. She looked at me, the same bounded expression. "Long enough," she said. Day 11 was the first simulation engagement. The first time the assessment moved from physical and navigation trials into something that actually involved combat. The IDC ran these in the full immersion simulator bays on Deck 7, which were state-of-the-art in a way that nothing else on Alias was. The rest of the station could be held together with institutional memory and maintenance cycles that were always slightly overdue, but the sim bays were current generation. Full haptic feedback, environmental variable control, opposition force simulation with genuine artificial tactical intelligence, and an observer gallery where the facilitators could watch and record everything. The scenario they ran us through first was a standard contested contact engagement. Vanguard fire team moving through a partially damaged installation with Werk occupation forces. Standard, which is to say, hard. The Werk didn't fight like humans. Their tactical AI simulation, even at the standard difficulty setting, used decision trees that human intuition found counterintuitive. You had to consciously override the part of your brain that read situations with human opponent assumptions and think differently, which was harder than it sounded. We were put through as teams of 6, and my rotation included me, Hollowell, Torres, Bautista, a man named Reyes who'd been in orbital infantry, and Mara Voss. The scenario began. And for about 4 minutes it was fine, controlled, manageable, the team moving well, the simulated environment doing what it was supposed to do, which was create pressure and require decisions. Hollowell took point. Bautista and Reyes worked flanks. Torres and I held the middle. Mara Voss was, I realized after the first minute, at the rear guard position. I didn't think about it at the time. Then the scenario escalated, the way they always escalate, with the particular simulation designer cruelty of hitting you right when you thought you had a handle on it. Secondary opposition force. Different entry vector. A squeeze play that was textbook Werk and that we were badly positioned for. Hollowell called a defensive consolidation, which was the right call. Everyone moved to the designated cover positions. Standard protocol. Mara Voss didn't consolidate. She moved. Not toward cover, outward, away from the group, which went against every standard defensive doctrine we'd been briefed on and which, in the half-second before I processed what she was doing, made me want to call out to pull her back. And then I understood what I was watching. She'd identified something. In the time it had taken the rest of us to register the new opposition vector and process a defensive response, she had already mapped the secondary forces approach, identified a structural position in the simulated installation's upper level, and was moving toward it with the specific purposeful economy of someone who had already decided on a course of action and was now executing it. She went vertical. There was a maintenance ladder in the simulation geometry, the kind of incidental environmental feature that most people ignored as background infrastructure. And she went up it in about 4 seconds, and she found a position at a junction of 2 beams about 12 meters above the engagement floor, and she did nothing. For a moment she just did nothing, and I thought, she's wrong, she's lost the picture, this is going to go badly. And then the secondary force appeared at the entry they'd been converging on, the direction the simulation AI had chosen because it was the most tactically advantageous, the direction that would have split our defensive formation and made the engagement dramatically more difficult. And she was already there, already above them, already in a position that the simulation AI had not calculated for, because the simulation AI operated with parameters that included standard human tactical behavior, and taking a perch 12 meters up on infrastructure that wasn't designed as a combat position was apparently outside the standard parameters. She took the secondary force apart with a precision that made the whole sequence feel slightly unreal. Not fast, she was never the fastest person in any space, but so accurate that speed was irrelevant. Every engagement was resolved, every target addressed, the secondary force neutralized while our primary defensive position held. The simulation ended. We stood in the post-scenario lights, the full immersion environment fading back to the gray walls of the sim bay. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Hollowell looked up at the junction where she was still positioned, 12 meters up, sitting on a structural beam like she'd always intended to be there. "Mara," he said. She looked down at him. "Where did you learn to do that?" he said. She considered the question. "I learned it from necessity," she said. "In the Verk contested corridor, you can't fight them the way they expect to be fought. You have to be somewhere they haven't accounted for." "How many times did you have to do that?" Tors said. She was looking up too, all of us were. Mara Voss looked at Tors with that expression, that bounded expression, the one with the wall behind it. "Enough times that it stopped feeling unusual," she said. She climbed down. The facilitator, observing from the gallery, made a longer mark than usual. That night, the night of day 11, I went back to the observation lounge, the small common area with the viewport that looked out toward the Kessler Nebula. I couldn't sleep again. This was becoming a pattern. I wasn't surprised to find her there. She was in the seat closest to the viewport, which was the same seat she always took in this space. I'd figured out by now that she had specific positions she defaulted to in every room, always the one with the best sightlines, always with maximum observable approach vectors, always slightly removed from the center of social gravity. She wasn't doing it consciously anymore, or if she was, the consciousness of it had gone so deep that it was indistinguishable from instinct. She had coffee, naturally. I sat down 2 seats away, because something about approaching closer than that felt like it required more trust than we'd established. I looked out the viewport. The nebula did its slow, impossible thing. "Can't sleep," she said. "No," I said. She made a sound that might have been agreement. We were quiet for a while. The recyclers hummed. "I keep trying to figure out how to ask you something," I said, without it coming out as either rude or naive. "Ask it," she said. "How long were you out there alone?" She was quiet for a moment, long enough that I thought I'd hit the boundary again. Then, 4 years, she said. "Give or take. Time tracking gets imprecise in sustained solo operations. You maintain operational rhythm and you track by mission cycles rather than calendar." 4 years. I let that sit in the air between us. "Doing what?" I said. "What I was trained to do," she said. "Finding things, tracking things. Monitoring Verk movement and disposition in the contested corridor and reporting to collection nodes when I could reach them. And when I couldn't reach a collection node," she paused, "dealing with problems independently." Dealing with problems independently. I thought about what that meant in contested space, with no unit support for 4 years. "Why are you here?" I said. "The IDC would have given you a station posting. They would have given you support roles, analysis positions. You don't need to do a vanguard selection." She turned from the viewport and looked at me. "I know what I'm capable of alone," she said. "I've had 4 years to learn what I'm capable of alone. I don't know what I'm capable of with people I trust behind me." She turned back to the nebula. "I'd like to find out," she said, "before it matters." End of Part 2. Part 3, What She Was Made Of. The VARK come to ALIUS. On the morning of day 17, the station's proximity alarm sounded. Not a drill. The selection program had a well-established relationship with non-drill alarms. They were supposed to be impossible during an active assessment cycle because the IDC specifically scheduled sessions away from high-risk operational periods. That was protocol. That was how it was supposed to work. The Werk Combine, as was their established practice, did not care about IDC scheduling protocols. I was in the middle of a technical assessment module when the alarm went, the kind that starts as a low tone and builds into something that makes your chest do a specific thing, that moves from alert to this, is real in about 3 seconds of acoustic escalation. The facilitator in the room, a young technical officer named Chandra, went very still for a moment in the way that people go still when they're receiving information on a frequency you can't hear. And then she said, "Everyone out. Defensive positions per station protocol. Go." We went. The corridors of Deadliest transformed in the way that military installations transform when something is actually happening. The quality of movement changed. The ambient sounds changed. The lighting shifted from the permanent amber to the red-orange of alert status, which made everything look like the inside of something burning. Personnel moved with purpose through the main passages. Someone was running at the far end of the corridor. The station's general address system was giving calm, automated instructions in the voice that general address systems always use for terrifying information, which is the voice of someone who has been trained to sound as though nothing is terrifying. The candidates assembled at the emergency muster point on Deck 4. All 31 of us who were still in the program. We'd had 7 more washouts or withdrawals over the previous 2 weeks. Oak was there, and 2 other senior facilitators, and 3 station security personnel whose body language was communicating something beyond what their faces were showing. "Werk contact," Oak said. He didn't have the slow build of someone trying to calibrate how much information to give. He just said it. "Forward sensor array is tracking a scouting element moving on an intercept course with Deadliest. Estimated time to close range is 40 minutes. "A scouting element," Hollowell said. 3 vessels, light configuration. They're not broadcasting intentions. "They never do," someone near the back said. "Low flat Maravas." Oak looked at her. "No. They don't." "What's the station's defensive posture?" Bautista said. "We have 2 patrol craft on standby. Station defense array is active. There are 17 IDC personnel currently on board beyond the selection program contingent. We've initiated a contact report to the nearest fleet element, but response time is," he paused, "not going to help us in the next 40 minutes. The air in the room changed. 31 candidates and 3 senior personnel doing the math that everyone in the room knew how to do and arriving at answers nobody wanted to look at directly. "What can we do?" Torres said. "At this point, station protocol is defensive consolidation," Oak said. "Non-military personnel to the core sections. Military personnel to assign defensive positions. We monitor and we—" "That's a passive position," Hollowell said. "That's current protocol," Oak said. "Against a Werk scouting element moving on an installation with minimal defensive assets, a passive position is." "I'm aware of what it is," Oak said. "Not sharp, just final." Silence. And then from the back of the muster point, Mara Voss said, "They're not scouting." Everyone looked at her. She was standing slightly apart from the group, in the way she always stood slightly apart, and she was looking at something on a small device in her hand. I recognized it now, the reader I'd noticed at dinner on the first night, which wasn't a reader at all, I realized, but some kind of compact tactical sensor tool. Personal equipment, not IDC issue. "What?" Oak said. "A scouting element doesn't come in at that vector," she said. She looked up from the device. "Not if they're scouting. That approach angle bypasses their standard observation passes. It's a direct approach vector. They've already done the scouting. They know what's here. They're coming for something specific." Oak was very still. What do you know about Verk approach vectors? Personal observation, she said, the same words she'd used in the briefing 2 weeks ago. 4 years of it. The room had gone so quiet I could hear the individual outputs of the air recyclers. Oak looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Chandra. Chandra gave him a small nod that I couldn't fully interpret, but that had the quality of "I told you so" delivered with maximum professionalism. "Voss," Oak said, "talk to me." She walked forward. Just like that, walked to the front, to where Oak was standing, and held out the compact device so he could see the display. She explained the vector analysis without preamble, without performance, with the flat practical cadence of someone briefing something they were certain about. I watched Oak's face as she talked. That's what I remember most about that particular minute. Not the words, I couldn't hear all of it from where I was standing. What I remember is Oak's face. Oak, who had been in IDC special operations for longer than most of us had been alive, who had the specific quality of someone who had seen a great deal and had stopped being easily moved by it. He was listening to Mara Voss, the way he'd listened to exactly no one else during the entire 3 weeks of the assessment. He was listening the way you listen to someone who knows something you need. What happened in the next 37 minutes is something I'm going to try to describe accurately, which is hard because parts of it I only understood afterward, and parts of it I was too busy surviving to observe properly, and parts of it I still don't have a complete picture of because there were things Mara Voss did in those 37 minutes that only she and the Verk who didn't make it back were positioned to see. But I'll tell you what I know. Oak made a decision that wasn't in the protocol book, which was to listen to her. He assembled a mixed element, 7 of us from the candidate group, plus 3 of the station security personnel, and he ran it the way you run things when you have limited assets and limited time, which is, figure out what each person is best at and build around that. And he built around Mara Voss. Not as a figurehead, not as a symbolic choice, as the operational anchor because she was the only person in the room who had spent 4 years learning, from inside contested Verk space, how the Verk actually operated when they weren't being observed by people they knew were watching. She'd spent 4 years watching them when they didn't know they were being watched. She knew how they thought. The plan she outlined was, I don't know how else to say this, alien in its logic. It didn't follow any of the doctrinal frameworks we'd been trained in. It didn't engage on the vectors that standard defensive doctrine would have used. It used the station's geometry in ways that I don't think the station designers had intended, and that definitely weren't in any emergency defensive manual. It was also, as Bautista said quietly to me while we were moving into position, exactly right. You could see it, once she'd laid it out. The way the pieces fit together wasn't human tactical logic. It was a replication of the same kind of non-obvious positional thinking she'd used in the simulation, scaled up, applied to an actual station with actual stakes. She'd learned to think like the Verk, and then she'd learned to use that thinking against them. I was positioned in the secondary corridor on Deck 3, with Hollowell and Tors, which put me in a support role for the initial engagement. I could communicate with the rest of the element, but I couldn't directly observe the primary positions. What I know about what happened in the primary positions comes from the recording, which I saw much later, and from what Hollowell and Tors told me, and from what Bautista said, and from the single conversation I had with Mara Voss afterward, which was short, and which I'm going to tell you about at the end. The Verk boarding element breached at the point she'd predicted, the secondary access junction on the station's exterior, which wasn't the most obvious entry point but which was, as she'd calculated, the point they'd use because it was the least visible approach from the station's primary defense array. The defense array was looking at the obvious entry points. She'd looked at what the array was looking at and found the blind angle. They came through in a formation she'd seen before. She was already there. What happened in the next 11 minutes? I timed it later from the recording. 11 minutes and some seconds was not what I would have called a firefight, because the word firefight implies an exchange, a mutual contest, two sides meeting with roughly comparable dynamics. What Mara Voss did in those 11 minutes was not a firefight. It was, and I've thought about the right word for this for a long time, and I keep coming back to the same one. It was a demonstration of what happens when you spend 4 years alone in contested space, developing a skill set at a level that no assessment program, no institutional training pipeline, no structured development environment can replicate, because the thing that makes you that good is precisely the fact that you had no safety net, no support. No one to tell you that you'd done enough, that the cost was too high, that you should pull back. You either developed that level of mastery, or you didn't come back. She'd come back. The Verk boarding element did not. When it was over, when the station's sensors confirmed the remaining Verk vessels had withdrawn, which they did suddenly and completely in a way that suggested they were operating on information that had reached them about what had happened to the boarding element, we assembled again at the muster point on Deck 4. We were all there, everyone. None of us from the candidate group had been killed or seriously injured, which was a thing I didn't fully process until I was standing there looking at the count and realizing what it meant. One of the station security personnel had a bad hypoxic incident from a hull breach in the section they'd been guarding, but she was conscious and talking. We were all there. And Mara Voss was. She was not at the front. She had returned to the back of the muster point, the same spot she'd occupied at every muster since day one, and she was standing there in her worn jacket looking at nothing particular with the expression of someone who had done a calculation, arrived at an answer, and filed it. She had a cut on her jawline that was going to need attention, and she was holding her left arm slightly differently from the right, which suggested something in the shoulder, but she wasn't showing the injury and she wasn't mentioning it. Oak stood at the front and he looked at the group for a long moment. The red-orange alert lighting had cycled back down to the ordinary amber. The recyclers hummed. "I'm going to say something," Oak said, "that I've never said to a candidate group before." We were very quiet. What happened in the last 40 minutes, the outcome of it, is the result of one person's knowledge and judgment and willingness to act on both without hesitation. He paused. "I've been in this program for 11 years. I've run 14 selection cycles. I've seen a lot of capable people come through this assessment." He looked at the back of the room. "Mara," he said. She looked at him, the same unhurried attention she'd given everything. "I don't know the full scope of what you've done," Oak said. "I don't have clearance for the full scope, but I know what I just watched, and I know what it meant for everyone in this room." She didn't say anything. "Thank you," he said. "And the group. I don't know what I expected to happen. Some acknowledgement, certainly, some recognition. The moment deserved it. What actually happened was that Hollowell, who was not a sentimental person, who'd been skeptical of her from the first day, who'd cataloged her absence of insignia as a suspicious gap, turned around and looked at her and said, "Where would you like to be?" And it took me a second to understand what he was asking, and then I did. Where would you like to be? In the group, not at the back, not alone, not in the position she'd assigned herself. Mara Voss looked at him for a long moment. And then she walked forward, not all the way to the front, not center stage. About 2/3 of the way up to where Tors was standing, and she stopped there, and Tors didn't say anything, just moved slightly to make space, and Mara Voss stood with the group. She was still quiet. She was still contained. She was still the person who watched more than she spoke and occupied space precisely and didn't perform. But she was in the middle of the group, not the back. And for the first time since I'd seen her sitting alone at the far corner of the mess hall on the first evening, she looked like she was exactly where she'd decided to be. I talked to her once more before the assessment ended. 2 days later in the observation lounge, the same place, the nebula, the recycler hum, the amber light. She had her coffee. I sat closer than 2 seats away this time. The IDC is going to build a whole program around what you did, I said. The way you mapped the Verk approach vectors, the positional framework, they're going to study it. She made a sound that might have been amusement. They'll try. Can you teach it? I said. She considered that seriously, the way she considered everything. I can teach what I did, she said. I can't teach what it cost. That part, what it took to develop it, that's not curriculum. That's circumstance. I was in the wrong places for a long time and I survived them and I learned. You can't design a program that replicates being actually hunted for 4 years. No, I said, I suppose not. She looked at the nebula. Why didn't you say anything, I said, in those first days about who you were? What you knew. You sat in the back and you said nothing and we all, I stopped, tried to find the honest version. We all decided you weren't worth paying attention to. She was quiet for a moment. Because I didn't want to be worth paying attention to, she said finally. That's not false modesty. It's just where I came from. The first thing you learn is that being noticed is a liability. You survive by not being noticed. You succeed by being the thing in the room that nobody's running a threat assessment on, because they've already decided you're not a factor. She turned and looked at me. The best position isn't the most visible one, she said. The best position is the one nobody thought to check. I looked at her. This woman who had spent 4 years in the most hostile environment in known human space, alone, developing a skill set so refined and so specific to survival that it had just saved 31 people who'd spent 2 weeks failing to see her. They're going to see you now, I said. She smiled. It was a small smile, quick, the kind that reaches the eyes and then retreats. Yeah, she said, I know. She looked back at the nebula. That's okay, she said. I think I'm ready for that.